All right, let's get into our Torah portion today. Open your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 1. And the way we're going to do this, we're going to read all of chapter 1, we're going to skip chapter 2, and we're going to read chapter 3. It's a long portion. All right, so that's how we'll do it today. These are the words Moshe spoke to all Israel on the far side of the Jordan River, in the desert, in the Arabah, across from Suf, between Paran, Tophel, Lavan, Hatzroth, and Di Zahav. It is 11 days' journey from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by way of Mount Seir. On the first day of the 11th month of the 40th year, Moshe spoke to the people of Israel, reviewing everything Adonai had ordered him to tell them. This was after he had defeated Sihon, king of the Amori, who lived in Heshbon, and Og, king of Bashan, who lived in Ashtaroth at Edrei. There, beyond the Jordan, in the land of Moab, Moshe took it upon himself to expound this Torah. And he said, Adonai spoke to us in Horeb, and he said, you have lived long enough by this mountain. Turn, get moving, go to the hill country of the Amorites, and all the places near there in the Arabah, the hill country, the Shephelah, the Negev, and by the seashore, the land of the Canaanites and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the Euphrates River. I have set the land before you. Go in, take possession of the land, Adonai swore to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov, and their descendants after them. And at that time I told you, you're too heavy a burden for me to carry alone. Adonai, your God, has multiplied your numbers so that there are as many of you today as there are stars in the sky. May Adonai, the God of your ancestors, increase you yet 1,000-fold and bless you as he promised you. But you are burdensome, bothersome, and quarrelsome. How can I bear it by myself alone? Pick for yourselves from each of your tribes men who are wise, understanding, and knowledgeable, and I will make them heads over you. You answered me. What you have said would be a good thing for us to do. So I took the heads of your tribes, men wise and knowledgeable, and made them heads over you, leaders in charge of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, of tens, and officers tribe by tribe. And at that time, I commissioned your judges. Hear the cases that arise between your brothers and judge fairly between a man and his brother and the foreigner who is with him. You are not to show favoritism when judging, but give equal attention to the small and to the great. No matter how a person presents himself, don't be afraid of him, because the decision is God's. The case that is too hard for you, bring to me, and I'll hear it. I also gave you orders at that time concerning all the things you were to do. So we left Horeb. We went through all that vast and fearsome desert, which you saw on the way to the hill country of the Amorites, as Adonai, our God, ordered us, and we arrived at Kadesh Barnea. And there I said to you, you have come to the hill country of the Amorites, which Adonai, our God, is giving to us. Look, Adonai, your God, has placed the land before you. Go up, take possession, as Adonai, the God of your ancestors, has told you. Don't be afraid. Don't be dismayed. And you approached me, every one of you, and said, let's send men ahead of us to explore the country for us and bring back word concerning what route we should use in going up and what the cities we will encounter like. The idea seemed good to me. So I took 12 of your men, one from each tribe, and they set out, went up into the hills, came to the Eshcol Valley, and reconnoitered it. They took some of the produce of the land, brought it down to us. They also brought back word to us. The land Adonai, our God, is giving to us is good. But you wouldn't go up. Instead, you rebelled against the order of Adonai, your God, and in your tents you complained. It's because Adonai hated us that he brought us out of the land of Egypt, only to hand us over to the Amorites to destroy us. What sort of place is it that we're heading for? Our brothers made our courage fail when they said, the people are bigger, taller than we are. The cities are great and fortified up to the sky. Finally, we have seen the Anakim there. And I answered you, don't be fearful. Don't be afraid of them. Adonai, your God, who is going ahead of you, will fight on your behalf, just as he has accomplished all those things for you in Egypt before your eyes. And likewise, in the desert, where you saw how Adonai, your God, carried you like a man carries a child, along the entire way you traveled until you arrived at this place. Yet in this matter, you don't trust Adonai, your God. Even though he went ahead of you, seeking out places for you to pitch your tents, showing you which way to go, fire at night, and a cloud during the day. And Adonai heard what you were saying, and he became angry. And he swore, not a single one of these people, this whole evil generation, will see the good land I swore to give to your ancestors, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh. He'll see it. I will give him and his descendants the land he walked on, because he has fully followed Adonai. Also, because of you, Adonai was angry with me and said, you too will not go in there. Yeshua, the son of Nun, your assistant, he will go in there. So encourage him, because he will enable Israel to take possession of it. Moreover, your little ones, who you said would be taken as booty, and your children who don't yet know good from bad, they'll go in there. I will give it to them. They will have possession of it. But as for yourselves, turn around, head into the desert by the road to the Sea of Suf. Then you answered me, we have sinned against Adonai, and now we will go up and fight in accordance with everything Adonai our God has ordered us. And every man among you put on his arms, considering it an easy matter to go up into the hill country. But Adonai said to me, tell them, don't go up, don't fight, because I'm not there with you. If you do, your enemies will defeat you. So I told you, you wouldn't listen. Instead, you rebelled against Adonai's order. You took matters into your own hands. You went up into the hill country, where the Amorites living in the hill country came out against you like bees and defeated you in Seir and chased you all the way back to Hormah. You returned and cried before Adonai, but Adonai neither listened to what you said nor paid any attention. This is why you had to stay in Kadesh as long as you did. Skipping to chapter 3. Then we turned and went up the road to Bashan, and Og, the king of Bashan, came out against us with all his people to fight at Edrei. And Adonai said to me, don't be afraid of him, for I have handed him all his people and his territory over to you. You will do to him as you did to Sihon, king of the Amori, the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon. So Adonai our God also handed him over to us, Og, the king of Bashan, with all of his people, and we defeated him until he had no one left. And at that time we captured all his cities. There was not one city of theirs that we didn't capture. There were 60 cities, all the region of Argob, the kingdom of Og in Bashan, all of them fortified cities, with high walls, gates, bars, in addition to a great number of unwalled towns. We completely destroyed them, as we did with Sihon, the king of Heshbon, annihilating every city, men, women, and little ones. But we took all the livestock, along with the spoil from the cities, as booty for ourselves. At that time, we captured the territory of the two kings of the Amorites east of the Yarden, the Jordan, between the Arnon Valley and Mount Hermon. The Hermon, which the Zidonim call Sirion, and the Amori call Senir. All the cities of the plain, all Gilead and all Bashan, as far as Salcah and Edrei, cities of the kingdom of Og in Bashan. Og, king of Bashan, was the last survivor of the Rephaim. His bed was made of iron. It is still in Rabbah with the people of Ammon. It is 9 cubits long, 4 cubits wide, using the normal cubit. Of this land that we took possession of then, I assigned to the Reubeni, that is the Reubenites, and the Gadites, the territory extending from Aroer all along the Arnon Valley, together with half the hill country of Gilead, including its cities. The rest of Gilead and all Bashan, the kingdom of Og, I gave to the half-tribe of Manasseh. The whole region of Argob, together with all Bashan, form what is called the land of Rephaim. Yair, the son of Manasseh, took all the region of Argob as far as the border with the Geshuri and the Maakati. He named this whole area, including Bashan, after himself, and it remains Havot Yair to this day. I gave Gilead to Machir, and to the Reubenites and to the Gadites I gave the territory from Gilead to the Arnon Valley, with the middle of the valley as the border, as far as the Yabok River, which is the border with the people of Ammon. The Arabah, too, the Jordan being its border, from Kinneret to the sea of the Arabah, the Dead Sea, at the foot of the slopes of Pisgah to the east. At that time I gave you this order. Adonai your God has given you this land to possess, but all of you who are fit to fight must cross over armed ahead of your brothers, the people of Israel. Your wives, your little ones, your livestock, I know you have much livestock, will stay in your cities, which I have given you, until Adonai allows your brothers to rest, as he has allowed you. And they too take possession of the land Adonai your God is giving them on the west side of the Jordan. At that point you will return each man of his own possession, which I have given you. Also at that time I gave this order to Yeshua. Your eyes have seen everything that Adonai your God has done to these two kings. Adonai will do the same to all the kingdoms you encounter when you cross over. Don't be afraid of them, because Adonai your God will fight on your behalf. Amen is right. In today's Torah portion, Moses opens the content of the 5th book of the Torah by recounting the 40 years that have passed since the Hebrews left Egypt. And rather than going through this review at any depth, I think it's better that we look at the book of Deuteronomy from a more panoramic view to get a good sense of it as the Israelites get ready to cross over the Jordan River into the Promised Land. Now, Deuteronomy picks up the wilderness journey of Israel as they ready themselves to enter into the land of Moab for its final leg, with Moses giving his final addresses to the people of Israel. The 3 addresses, beginning in chapter 1, will interlace history and the law. And as we read those words, it seems that quite often the precise facts of certain incidents on their 40-year wilderness trek are not presented by Moses in the same mold as we read them in the earlier 4 books of Torah, because he's presenting everything in the light of hindsight. Now, picture Moses. Picture Moses as he stands on a hill, a high hill in Moab, that sits but a stone's throw away on the west bank of the Jordan River, overlooking the Promised Land. And he is addressing the leaders and the elders of Israel, even though his words are intended for all of Israel to hear, because indeed there is no practical way that his voice could have been heard by more than a few hundred people at absolute best. Now, thankfully, for the 3 million refugees from Egypt, the wandering is finally coming to a close. The people of Israel are near to possessing the land that had been officially set aside for them in the covenant of Abraham 6 centuries earlier. Now, this will be the first territory that Israel, as an identifiable nation of people, have ever been able to call their own. But taking possession of that land is not going to come easily or peacefully. The 600,000 man Hebrew army is going to have to prosecute a holy war against a number of different petty potentates and mighty kings, and even some city-states that reside there. The general term the Bible uses for all of them is Canaanites. And this is because they are each established in the general region known as Canaan, as opposed to them having any kind of affiliation, confederacy, or common nationhood. None of these various people groups have any intention of simply turning their territory over to Israel merely because Israel claims that their God is given to them as their own. Now, in addition to recounting how Israel got to where they are at this moment, Moses also expounds on at least 50% of the laws and the commands given to them at Mount Sinai. And as he recalls these many laws and commands, sometimes point by point, he tells Israel what it is they're to conclude is God's purpose for giving them this law. And while he may not use the same words, Moses explains that the law is to be the beating heart underlying their society. It is the moral code God intends for all humans, but for the moment, it is in the possession of Israel. Now, because of the eventual universality of the law of Moses, we're going to find Moses explaining the law by elevating it from its current physical, if not mechanical, level to the higher spiritual plane of godly principles that govern all things, anywhere, during any era or age. He'll explain why certain required rituals and behaviors were laid down the way they were, what their higher purpose is, the underlying God principles behind them, and therefore why they are important, and they're to be obeyed as ordained into perpetuity. Therefore, Moses says that this is still the law that was enacted at Mount Sinai 40 years earlier. And this is the way that the first generation of the Exodus has practiced it up to now. However, says Moses, I'm going to tell you what it all means. And as we prepare to enter the promised land, this is how we should better understand it. How we should execute God's instructions when acquiring that land and for when we settle there. Now, it ought not to surprise us that there is a New Testament counterpart of Moses' speech coming from the mouth of Yeshua in the book of Matthew that does essentially the same thing. Moses took the law from the primarily physical behavioral aspect to a more spiritual plane in Deuteronomy. And in the Sermon on the Mount, Yeshua takes the spiritual element Moses gave to the law in Deuteronomy, much of which had been lost by the first century, moves it to a renewed, higher, and purer spiritual level. Yeshua says, and I paraphrase, here is historically how your ancestors thought of these commands of God, how the traditions of men have affected it, and all the ways they got it wrong. But I'm here to tell you what it actually means and how it is intended to operate. So in Deuteronomy, we essentially have the first mediator of God, Moses, expounding on the ideal of the law. And in the book of Matthew, we have the second and better mediator of God, Yeshua, expounding further on the ideal of the law. The reason and conditions behind the first expounding of the law in the Bible by Moses was his coming death and the imminent entry of God's people into the promised land of Canaan, God's earthly kingdom. The reason and conditions behind the second expounding of the law in the Bible by Yeshua was his coming death and the imminent entry of God's people into God's spiritual kingdom as that spiritual kingdom of a higher plane. And I hope this makes sense to you. Because if you can understand this parallel connection that I just drew for you about Israel's two mediators, then you have a good basic context for understanding Deuteronomy and, secondarily, the gospel accounts of the New Testament. Second, this is but further dramatic proof of God's established patterns and cycles that began early in Genesis, that remain with Israel centuries later and are never ending until the current universe as we know it no longer exists. As we move steadily through the Bible, these patterns that began as mere dust and clay, physical, progressively move into a higher and higher and yet higher spiritual plane until at the end of the Bible, all the laws and patterns established by Yahweh are at the absolute ultimate spiritual perfection and essence that Yahweh had planned and ordained for his creation, because essentially there will come a time when the lines between heaven and earth start to blur and eventually fully merge into one. And third, it helps to establish that the newness of the so-called New Testament is not about a new set of principles or additional principles or some principles, laws, abolished and replaced by different ones. Rather, the newness is that the Messiah prophesied in the Old Testament has finally come. He is Yeshua of Nazareth. And all that was promised in the Torah and the prophets has come with him. Or in some cases, the process of redemption has been advanced towards the ultimate world to come. I'd also like to point out that this constant drumbeat we've always heard in the Constantinian Church about love and grace and peace and mercy and redemption as being a new revelation that is the core of the New Testament system or dispensation is simply incorrect. All of these attributes and principles were first introduced in the Torah and in the prophets, and much of it right here in Deuteronomy. Now let me comment about another aspect of the Sermon on the Mount, parallel with Moses' address in Moab to the people of Israel. Actually, it was a series of 3 addresses in Deuteronomy. This was more a sermon about application than a re-rendering of the code of laws given as an oracle from God on Mount Sinai. This is why the Sermon on the Mount is called a sermon, not an oracle. It was Yeshua preaching and teaching on the law, not him creating a second or a new law. It was the same on the mountain of Moab with Moses as the orator. He was preaching about the law, not making new laws or abolishing old ones. Perhaps one of the more difficult things to reconcile for a believer with a long traditional church background and who has come to understand the era of the end times that we have likely entered is the reality that Israel is in process of having the torch of the gospel message handed back to them by the Gentiles who took the lead of evangelizing for around 1800 or so years. And along with that is how to approach that section of the Bible that has been relegated to the trash bin for so long, but for which a renewed interest is growing. The Old Testament. And while the largest segment of the church continues with the mantra that they are Bible believing, in fact, they're only New Testament believing. Therefore, to accept Israel's role in our time and in the future amounts to a direct refutation of some of Christianity's oldest, most cherished doctrines and faith principles. See, we who are part of the Hebrew roots movement have struggled right along the rest of our believing brothers and sisters who form the larger and more mainstream portion of the church about just how to deal with the very ancient code of laws that we find in the Torah. However, we have come to the conclusion that the Torah is as much for Gentile believers as for Jews. How then does a modern believer keep Torah? Or is even supposed to in a culture 2 millennia removed from Christ's era, more than 3 from Moses's? Are we to avoid wearing clothes of mixed fabrics? Are we to reestablish a male-dominated society? Are we to eat only eat food grown under the biblical purity ordinances? Should we reestablish cities of refuge for those who kill accidentally and at the same time stone to death those who commit adultery? Are we to celebrate the biblical festivals and observe the seventh-day Sabbath? Men, are we to adopt rabbinical Jewish traditions like wearing kippahs, supporting full beards, reading from the Jewish prayer books? Should we insist that we sit apart from our wives during congregational services? Women, should you see yourselves as unclean during your period? Remove yourself from your husband during that time and immerse in a mikveh upon the end of the cycle. Are you to cover your hair? You see, the thing is that the matter of how to deal with the Torah and the law as societies change and time marches on began early on. Moses in Deuteronomy, a mere 40 years after the Torah was given to him, draws attention to the fact that the issue he is addressing in Moab is not whether these laws and principles still exist, but rather how to apply and adapt them in this evolving societal conditions and in various locations. Yeshua did essentially the same. But he was also concerned in his sermon with something Moses didn't have to contend. Moses didn't have to tell the people that the law would continue to be enforced because he was addressing the people of the law who knew their parents had agreed to the covenant they made with God. And any thought that the law would be terminated was unthinkable. But 1,300 years later, on a grassy hill overlooking the Galilee, Yeshua was speaking to a crowd of Jews, some Gentiles, and he needed to make it crystal clear that nothing he said should be construed as abolishing even the slightest sliver of the law, nor was he changing the pronouncements of the prophets. And to emphasize his point, he said that not until heaven and earth passed away could such a thing even be contemplated. We find that portion of his discourse in Matthew 5. Therefore, my brethren, pay very close attention, as out of necessity, we're going to be moving far too quickly through Deuteronomy, because we're going to see how Israelite culture had evolved after only 4 decades. And thus there was a practical need for adapting the details of how to observe the law to account for their new condition. And we all find ourselves in the same position today if we approach God's word with intellectual honesty, as opposed to through the lens of man-made doctrines that have dominated our faith for 16 centuries. It shouldn't be bypassed that this address by Moses on the mountains of Moab is apparently made on his own volition. Certainly, as God's mediator, it's his prerogative to address the people of God as he sees fit, as it was ordained back at the burning bush that whatever Moses spoke, it was as if God spoke it. The point is that Moses here in Deuteronomy is speaking as God's official mediator. But Moses is using his own words, as inspired as they are, and is making these addresses not because they are new oracles coming from God, but because Moses has decided it's needed at this point. It is beginning with verse 6 of chapter 1 that the retrospective on the journey through the wilderness is undertaken. It includes a reminder of all the mighty acts that God performed in order that Israel would know Yahweh as their God. And not surprisingly, the history lesson begins with the earliest part of the journey, and therefore it is speaking not about the people of the generation of Israel now standing before Moses in Moab, but rather about the first generation of the Exodus, the previous generation to the one he's now addressing, who are all dead and gone. And Moses reminds them that Israel was told by God in a rather impatient manner that it was time to leave Mount Sinai and move on into the promised land that he had so long prepared for them. but for which they seem not terribly anxious to do. The point that was not lost on this newest generation of Israelites is that they could have been born inside a land of milk and honey instead of inside a goatskin tent on a dusty trail next to a desert oasis, if only their parents had been obedient. Israel should have already been settled in Canaan, enjoying the fruits of the land some 38 or so years earlier. You and I should not lose the point of this, as it applies directly to us and our reluctance to lay hold of the victories and purposes God has already given to us. He expects us to go forward and claim those victories and pursue those purposes in deeds and action, even though they may be personally costly or even a bit fearful. Put a finer point on it, Israel was essentially spiritually dormant for 40 years because they lacked faith and trust and didn't have much courage. They essentially marched around in circles, marking time, merely existing, because the distance they had to travel to get to Canaan was a matter of a few months, not several years. Sadly, in retrospect, they weren't now any closer to the promised land in this 40th year of their journey than they had been when they had been gone for barely a year after they left Egypt. Imagine, 38 years earlier, they had stood on the threshold of Canaan. But rather than entering into God's promise as he bid them to do, they said, "No thanks, looks a little too scary. Think we'll just march back to our previous lives in Egypt." The problem was that generation who left Egypt certainly believed in God. But despite all their claims, they didn't actually trust him. Oh, what a difference. They constantly irritated Moses and Jehovah by asking the utterly insulting rhetorical question, why did God bring us out here in the wilderness? Just to die? They knew who Jehovah was. Oh, they believed he existed and that he was their God, especially after witnessing those amazing miracles back in Egypt. I mean, goodness, they had been following a fiery cloud all this time and eating manna that simply fell from the sky for them. Nonetheless, they did not trust in God's ability to care for them or his determination to protect and guide them. And so it took Israel 40 years to gain what they could have had in one. James, brother of Yeshua, put this another way. James 2:19 and 20. Oh, you believe that God is one. Good for you. Demons believe it too. The thought makes them shudder with fear. But foolish fellow, do you want to be shown that such faith apart from actions is barren? See, this God principle of a passive, barren faith versus an active, living faithfulness remains. Acceptance of our redemption, that's one thing. Acting upon the obligations we now have to God as a redeemed person, and on the commands of God that are, in a sense, really only for the redeemed anyway, are another. Israel was redeemed. They've been redeemed several weeks before God gave them his laws and commands. But even as a redeemed people, they were utterly useless to the Lord. His kingdom and his purposes for them until they were ready to trust God. Until they were ready to move forward based on trust. I want to be clear on this for modern believers. That does not mean everything's going to be okay for us. It doesn't mean that God's just going to clear away all the obstacles in our paths. It means that we have to be willing to sincerely put it all on the line, accepting whatever the outcome for our faithful obedience might be. Israel had not been ready to do that at first. But now, through a series of very hard lessons, over a long period of time, they had finally become ready to step up to the plate. Not naively, but eyes wide open to the very real risks involved, the battle that lay ahead for the land of Canaan. I'm going to close out today's Torah portion with this thought. I cannot stress enough that a passive attitude of believers is wrong and it's powerless. Doctrine-based faith has literally turned the God principles we see being expressed in Deuteronomy on its head. We have tended to make our acceptance of God's redemption, our salvation, as our first and last obligations of obedience to Him. Because too much it is said, oh, that's all that matters, just getting saved. However, what the Bible, beginning with the Torah, teaches us is that first we accept our redemption, and as Paul says, that's not really to be considered a particular work or good deed on our part. And once that occurs, now we are expected to act upon our trust in God. And guess what happens if we don't act? We're basically put into a state of dormancy. Israel of the Exodus is a great example of this. Want to get saved? And then determine to place yourself into suspended animation until you close your eyes on earth for that final time? And then open them again in heaven? Yeah, fine. Lord has a name for that. It's called fruitless, barren, and even rebellion.
For more teaching and information, visit us online today. Come and be a part of our fellowship. Here at The Seed, enjoy worshiping and learning God's Word with us.